Welcome to No Name, the place where the quiet corners of America's campgrounds hide stories you won't forget. Tonight, we take you deep into the forests of Oconee State Park, South Carolina, where a lone RV camper's ordinary trip turns into a slow, unnerving descent into fear. If you've ever camped alone or wondered what really happens when the woods grow silent and someone or something is watching, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, and if this tale unsettles you as much as it unsettled me, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your own experiences in the comments. Every story adds to the unseen tapestry of the campgrounds we love and the mysteries that hide within them. I never expected that the sound of a distant hollow knock could make my skin crawl the way it did that night in Oconee State Park. My name is Garrett. I'm 34 and I've been RV camping for most of my adult life. Alone, with friends, sometimes with strangers I met along the way. I tell myself I'm experienced, that I know the rhythms of the forest, the subtle shifts of wind that tell you when the world is still or when it's hiding something. But that night, everything I thought I understood about isolation and caution unraveled. It was March of 2020, early in the season. The park was just starting to come alive again, buds on the trees, streams swelling from the last rain, the faint smell of pine and damp earth in the air. I had pulled into a small tucked-away campsite, one of the few that allowed overnight parking for larger RVs. The other sites nearby were mostly empty, the forest pressing in close on all sides, shadows folding over themselves in ways that made me feel slightly watched, even as the sunlight was still warm on my back. Setting up wasn't unusual. I had my routines down. Steps for leveling the van, hooking up electricity, double-checking water and propane. But the moment I stepped out of the RV to close the slides, I noticed him. Or maybe it was just a figure at first. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a hooded jacket despite the mild afternoon, standing by the tree line at the far end of the road that led into the camping area. I thought, maybe it's just another camper, maybe someone hiking, maybe nothing. But then he tilted his head as if studying me in a way that felt unnatural. I waved, the kind of casual, friendly gesture that would normally go unnoticed or welcomed. He didn't wave back, didn't even move. He just lingered there. And as I walked back toward my van, I could feel that creeping tension starting at the base of my skull, a tightness that's familiar to anyone who has ever felt that something small and wrong is about to snowball. The day went on. I tried to shake it off. I started a small fire in the pit at my site, brewed some coffee, and opened a book. I told myself he was probably just lost, or maybe another camper waiting for friends, but the forest has a way of warping your mind when you're alone. Every sound, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, the way the wind shifted across the trees, made me glance over my shoulder. As evening approached, the unease solidified. I caught glimpses of him again, fleetingly, when I went to dump trash in the communal bins, always just at the edge of vision, moving slowly along the road. I told myself I was imagining things, that he was simply walking the park roads, but my stomach knotted each time. There was something deliberate in the way he moved. Not hiking, not casual wandering. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it pressed on the edge of my mind in a way that made sleep feel like a risk I couldn't yet afford. Night fell, and with it the forest's voice changed. Owls, distant coyotes, the sigh of the wind shifting in the pines. It all became a symphony of suggestion. I double-checked my locks, turned on the small overhead lights, and sat by the window. That's when I noticed him again. Only this time, he wasn't just at the edge of the trees. He was walking along the campsite road, slow, deliberate, heading toward my RV. My heart thumped with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years, not fear of animals, not worry about weather, but a precise human unease. I debated going outside, but something instinctively told me that confronting him would do nothing but escalate the situation. So I stayed inside, watching. The headlights of my van reflected off the side mirrors, illuminating him just enough to see the hood still up, his hands shoved deep in pockets. He stopped briefly, just short of the main path, then moved again, as if pacing. It's hard to describe the dread of watching someone so close, knowing they are aware of you, yet not knowing what they intend. Hours passed. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of the underbrush pulled me out of any attempt to close my eyes. By the time the first faint light of dawn bled into the sky, he was gone, or at least I thought he was. I convinced myself I'd been seeing shadows, tricks of the mind on too little sleep, too much solitude. I needed coffee, needed routine. I stepped outside as the day warmed, trying to shake the lingering tension. But then I saw it, a single boot print in the soft dirt near my sight, large, heavy, and unmistakably human. Not an animal, not some errant hiker passing by. And it led away toward the forest, then disappeared entirely. It was in that moment, standing there in the clearing with my coffee mug trembling slightly in my hand, that I realized how vulnerable I truly was. In all my years of camping, I had felt alone many times, but never under the gaze of a presence that seemed to exist solely to observe. That quiet unease had grown into something deeper, something that whispered there were limits to my knowledge, to my ability to predict human behavior. By the next evening, I convinced myself I would move to a different site. Somewhere with more people, more activity, less isolation. And as I drove down the winding roads of the park to find a new site, I caught a glimpse in the mirror of someone standing near the previous site, half hidden by the trees. He lifted a hand, not in greeting, not in farewell, just raised it as if marking the spot, as if claiming the memory of my presence. I told myself to keep driving, to ignore it, to focus on the routine of survival in the small, controlled bubble of my RV. But the image stuck. What unsettled me most wasn't the presence itself, but the way the forest seemed to conspire with it. Every time I moved or paused, the environment seemed to shift in a way that amplified the tension. Birds would fall silent as I approached. The wind would pause for a moment, and shadows that were benign during the day stretched long and strange across the roads. By nightfall, even when the campground seemed empty, I could feel that same weight of eyes, watching, measuring, waiting. The new site I found was on the opposite edge of the campground, closer to the main road, near a cluster of other RVs. I told myself safety was in numbers, that the mere presence of other campers would dilute the strange attention from the previous night. But the forest doesn't care about logic, and fear doesn't obey rationality. Even in a busier area, every sound seemed to stretch longer, to echo with intention. I set up quickly, trying to stick to routine, slide out extended, leveling blocks under the tires, water and power checked. But even as I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? Why hadn't he approached, hadn't spoken, hadn't done anything at all, other than linger in that half-observed, half-concealed way? My rational mind argued that this was just a person with odd habits, a loner camper like me, maybe someone with quirks, maybe even a harmless observer of the forest. But the gnawing sensation in my chest refused to accept that simple explanation. Night fell again, heavier this time, the shadows pressing closer, more suffocating. I kept the overhead lights on in the RV, but they only highlighted the darkness outside, turning the forest into an opaque wall that seemed almost sentient. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but every sound, a footstep on gravel from a nearby camper, the snapping of a small branch, pulled me out of any illusion of comfort. I began checking the perimeter of my sight through the windows, scanning for any movement, any sign. That's when I noticed him again. He wasn't at the edge of the trees this time. He was standing just outside the faint glow of my RV lights, barely visible, but there, watching. I froze, a hot panic pooling in my stomach, unsure whether to step outside, confront him, or retreat further into the false sanctuary of my van. My fingers trembled as I gripped the window frame. For what felt like hours, I stared, willing him to move, willing him to leave, willing myself to be brave. But he didn't. He just stayed there, silent, unmoving, the hood of his jacket casting a shadow over his face, the faintest hint of a figure against the dark. I realized with a sinking dread that this wasn't about confrontation. It wasn't about action. It was about presence. about the psychological weight of being observed when there was nowhere to hide. The forest, the campsite, the road, they all seemed complicit, echoing every twitch of my nerves. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every exhale sharp in the stillness. Sleep was impossible. Hunger didn't matter. Water felt irrelevant. The world had shrunk to the space between me and him, between the security of the RV and the looming unknown outside. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, to rationalize. Maybe he was another camper who had a similar habit of pacing at night. Maybe he had lost his group. Maybe I was overreacting. But the small, deliberate movements I had observed, the tilting of his head as he watched, the slow, measured steps along the forest edge, undermined every rational argument. It was too deliberate, too precise, too aware. I spent the rest of the night alternating between checking the windows and retreating to the corner of my bed, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Shadows in the forest shifted, and every sound, even the distant murmur of the river, felt amplified, charged with meaning. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that the human mind, when left in isolation and faced with unknown intent, has a tendency to catastrophize. But that knowledge brought no comfort. I wasn't catastrophizing. I was aware, painfully aware, that someone had chosen to observe me, and that observation alone carried a weight that pressed down through the thin walls of my RV, down into my chest, into my mind. By morning, the figure was gone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing but the memory of his presence etched into my nerves. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the surrounding woods. The other campers were stirring, stretching into the day, oblivious to the tension that had gripped me. I tried to normalize my breathing, to convince myself the worst was behind me. But there was a residue of fear, a sticky unease that refused to leave. I resolved to stay vigilant, to stick to routines that might keep me safe, to limit my exposure to the forest's edge after dark. Every subsequent day was a delicate dance of observation and avoidance, checking for the glint of a hood in the trees, the subtle movements of the forest that suggested I was not alone. And yet, as I moved about the campground, I began to notice small signs that unnerved me. A chair slightly shifted from where I had left it. A plastic cup tipped over on the ground with no wind to blame. Footsteps that weren't mine, echoing briefly behind the van, disappearing before I could verify their source. The psychological tension became almost unbearable. I started sleeping in the driver's seat of the RV, engine occasionally running for light and warmth, keys in hand. Every time I stepped outside for water or to dump trash, my eyes scanned the periphery, searching for any sign, any flicker of movement. The forest became an antagonist, not in some supernatural sense, but in the way it manipulated perception, warped light and shadow, and whispered doubts into my mind. By the third night, I had begun to question my own sanity. Was I truly being observed, or had my imagination woven a phantom out of the stress of isolation? And then, just as I was trying to push the thought away, I saw him again. Not far, not fleetingly, but walking along the main gravel path, head tilted in the same unnerving study I had seen before. He paused, glancing toward my RV, and then, almost imperceptibly, he lifted one hand. Not to wave, not to gesture, but as if marking me, acknowledging my presence in a way that implied permanence. I felt panic rise. My limbs stiffened. I debated every option: confrontation, flight, calling someone. But reason was swallowed by fear. So I did the only thing that felt right. I retreated. I stayed in the van, lights dim, watching, willing the world to remain still. Hours passed. My mind cycled through every plausible scenario. I tried to reason him out of existence. He couldn't be real. He had to be a mirage, a trick of shadows and imagination. And yet my gut told me otherwise. My instincts, honed through years of solitary camping, told me he was real, and that he was deliberately there, on my edge, testing boundaries I hadn't yet realized I possessed. Morning came, hesitant and gray. I left the site immediately, driving slowly, scanning the forest edges, listening for any sound that might indicate pursuit. I avoided eye contact with any distant figure, and though I never saw him again, the imprint of his presence lingered. Even weeks later, in the sunlight of more crowded, safer campgrounds, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the tension of expectation, the eerie familiarity of someone who watches without reason, without confrontation, without closure. It was then I realized that the most enduring fear isn't violence or physical threat. It's the awareness that someone could, without words or action, impose themselves into your mind. That psychological imprint lingers, shaping your behavior long after the physical danger is gone. I had learned the hard way that isolation magnifies subtle cues, that shadows and silence can be as threatening as overt action, and that the forest, beautiful, wild, intoxicating, can become an accomplice to the mind's darkest suspicions. I left Oconee State Park with my routines intact, my RV ready for the next journey, but with a permanent respect for the unseen, the unprovoked, the quiet dread that can settle in the mind of anyone who ventures into isolation. The encounter didn't end in violence, didn't require confrontation, and perhaps that was what made it so profound. Because fear, when it is earned in silence, has a way of etching itself into memory far deeper than any scream or shout ever could. I remember the exact moment I felt the forest shift around me, like it had been waiting silently for us to arrive. My name is Ethan. I was 29 at the time, and I had convinced 3 of my closest friends, Mark, Jenna, and Lucas, that an October weekend in the Shenandoah Valley would be the perfect escape. We'd all grown up chasing the idea of camping, the freedom of being untethered from city lights, and I had a particular fascination with dispersed camping. No neat rows of RVs, no crowded campgrounds, just the land, the air, and whatever stories it wanted to whisper. We'd parked my aging Volkswagen camper van at the base of a ridge the map promised was secluded, and as we unloaded our gear, the late afternoon light filtered through the golden leaves, casting elongated shadows that seemed to flicker like nervous energy. I remember the subtle shift in temperature first, an almost imperceptible chill that ran along my spine, though the sun still hung stubbornly in the sky. Lucas laughed when I mentioned it. "You're imagining things, Ethan. It's just fall." But even as I tried to laugh along, I couldn't shake the sensation that the ridge itself was aware we were there. We set up camp near a slight hollow, the van angled to catch the last rays of light on its roof. Jenna unpacked the small propane stove while Mark collected firewood along the ridge. Lucas and I wandered up to a small creek we'd spotted on the map, our boots crunching over brittle leaves. The water was shallow, nearly golden in the fading sun, but I noticed how the forest's silence made each splash echo in a way that felt unnatural, like the woods were listening, cataloging our every step. That night, around the fire, the first unsettling noises began. They were subtle at first, a crack of twigs somewhere deep in the shadow beyond our circle of light, and a faint, long-drawn exhale that could have been the wind, or something else entirely. I told myself it was just deer or the wind moving through the hollows. Mark joked about Shenandoah spirits trying to scare city folk, and Jenna laughed nervously, sipping her coffee from a thermos. But the laughter felt hollow, and even as we joked, I kept hearing it. The exhale, a sound almost human, but stretched and hollowed in a way that no animal could produce. By the time we went to sleep, I was the last to climb into the van. I remember watching the ridgeline as the sun dipped completely behind it, leaving the woods in a deep, bruised blue. Something about the darkness felt heavier here than anywhere else I'd camped before. I lay awake, listening to the creaking of the trees and the distant calls of birds settling for the night, but then I noticed another sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible, a distant scream, quickly swallowed by the night. I froze. "Guys," I whispered, nudging Lucas, who was already snoring. "Did you hear that?" He muttered something incoherent, half asleep, and rolled over. I strained my ears, telling myself it was probably a fox, maybe a lost hiker, anything to rationalize it. But deep down, I felt the first real spike of fear, the kind that churns in your gut and makes your limbs feel heavy yet taut. Sleep came in fits, fragmented, haunted by every sound beyond the thin metal walls of the van. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching the leaves around the vehicle. I bolted upright, heart hammering, only to see nothing but shadows. The others were oblivious in their sleep. I tried to convince myself again, reasoning through each sound, each eerie vibration of the night, but the forest had already begun to reshape my perception. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves felt like an approaching presence. Morning brought temporary relief. The sun rose through mist that hovered above the ridge, and the light transformed the woods into a familiar, if still uneasy, landscape. We made coffee and breakfast, trying to laugh off the tension from the night. But even in daylight, I noticed things that gnawed at me. The way the wind seemed to carry sound strangely, how shadows clung to certain hollows more than others, and a subtle shift in our surroundings that suggested we were not alone. By mid-afternoon, curiosity and a stubborn desire to dismiss the fear from the previous night led us deeper into the ridge. Mark insisted on scouting for a perfect overlook, and we followed, joking about haunted campgrounds and ghost stories. But the further we walked, the more I felt eyes tracking us. I told myself it was paranoia, but then came the smell, a pungent, iron-like scent, faint but distinct, like metal warmed by sun and decay. Jenna wrinkled her nose and asked if I'd noticed it too. I hesitated, seeing the faintest quiver of worry in her expression before she masked it with a joke. It was then we heard the calls. At first, low and distant, a sound like a human voice distorted, crying for help, or maybe shouting a warning. I froze, a cold sweat pooling at my temples. Lucas laughed nervously, saying it must be a hiker, someone lost. But the voices didn't behave like any human I'd ever known. They came from impossible angles, rising and falling in pitch, echoing off trees in ways that made it impossible to locate their source. Fear clawed at my chest, a visceral panic I couldn't shake. My friends tried to move forward, but I stopped, insisting we turn back. As we retraced our steps, the forest seemed to constrict. Every branch scratched like fingernails against the vanishing light. Shadows stretched unnaturally, playing tricks on our eyes. The distorted calls continued intermittently, punctuated by long, low exhalations that sent tremors through my limbs. I realized we had wandered into a hollow that was deceptively shaped, a natural amphitheater where sound carried in ways that made it impossible to determine where it originated. The adrenaline kicked in fully as dusk fell. One of the calls seemed to come from directly behind us, a scream that pierced through the ridge with uncanny clarity. Jenna screamed, and I grabbed her arm, dragging her forward. Lucas and Mark followed, shouting to coordinate, but the voices moved with us, always just a few steps ahead, always impossible to locate. I felt my mind start to fracture under the psychological strain, each call, each untraceable echo, feeding into a spiral of dread I couldn't stop. We finally stumbled back to the van, hearts racing, lungs burning. I slammed the doors, locked them, and we all sat in the cramped space, silent except for ragged breathing. For a while, it seemed the forest had decided to leave us alone. But then came the knocking. Slow, deliberate, 3 taps on the metal side of the van. My stomach lurched. No one spoke. The knocks repeated, and I realized they were moving along the vehicle, pausing at each panel as though circling us. My rational mind fought for an explanation. Branches, animals, a prank. But deep down, I knew nothing could produce the precision of those taps. By nightfall, the fear had fully rooted itself. None of us slept again. The forest around us pressed with its silence, punctuated by occasional calls, sometimes human, sometimes impossibly warped, always sending a jolt of panic through my chest. We barely spoke, each of us wrapped in our own defensive thoughts, trying to rationalize the terror while knowing beneath the surface that this wasn't an ordinary camping experience. And that's when I learned the cruelest lesson of dispersed camping. The solitude that makes the forest beautiful also makes it a labyrinth. Every step, every sound, every shadow becomes a question of perception. I realized that the ridge wasn't just a landscape, it was a mirror of our own fears, amplifying them until rational thought felt almost fragile. We survived the night, but the psychological scars ran deep. I understood then that fear, left unchecked in isolation, could grow faster than any predator, any storm, any physical threat. The next morning arrived slowly, as if the ridge itself had intentionally dragged time across our faces, unwilling to let us move freely into daylight. I couldn't bring myself to open the van's blinds fully, peering instead through a narrow slit, trying to convince myself the forest was just trees and sunlight, but every shadow seemed to twitch with intention. Jenna, pale and trembling, finally whispered, "We need to leave." I nodded, even though a part of me wanted to prove to myself that we weren't cowards, that this was just an elaborate trick of nature. Breakfast was silent. The coffee steamed in our mugs, thick and bitter, but it couldn't mask the iron tang of fear lingering in the air. Mark kept scanning the ridge through the van's windows, saying little, while Lucas fidgeted with the radio, flipping channels, desperate for human voices, for confirmation that the outside world still existed. But all we heard were static-filled bursts, and faintly, that impossible, warped call that seemed to linger just beyond the reach of sound waves. We packed quickly, the urgency of leaving seeping into our movements. Yet, even as we moved, I couldn't shake the sensation that the forest had memorized our patterns, that it anticipated every step. Twigs snapped beneath our boots, but the sound felt unnatural, echoing unnervingly in the hollow as if someone or something was mimicking us. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then Jenna froze, staring into the tree line. "What is it?" I whispered. She pointed. I squinted, trying to pierce the veil of trees and mist. At the far edge of the clearing, a figure, or the semblance of one, moved between trunks, tall, angular, yet dissolving whenever I blinked. I felt my pulse spike. My rational mind screamed that this was just the way light and shadow played tricks on the eyes. Yet the instinctive fear, the one I'd learned to trust, gnawed at my gut. We didn't stop. The van roared to life, tires crunching over the brittle forest floor. Every instinct urged me to look away, to focus only on the path ahead, yet peripheral glimpses of movement haunted us. Shadows detaching from trees, twisting, stretching toward the van as if reaching. The distorted cries continued, sometimes below us, sometimes above, impossible to pinpoint. I felt the first real panic, hot and choking, as if the forest itself had wrapped invisible hands around my chest. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost its meaning. The road back to the main highway was narrow, littered with rocks and fallen limbs, and every turn seemed to conceal another hollow, another impossible echo. At one point, a scream erupted, sharp and human-like, right behind the van. I slammed on the brakes. Mark swore, looking out the rear window, but saw nothing. The sound had vanished as suddenly as it appeared. I realized then that the calls weren't coming from a creature, at least not in any conventional sense. They were coming from the terrain itself, amplified, distorted, a natural theater for sound that transformed ordinary echoes into horrifying possibilities. Every rational explanation only fueled a deeper unease. Lucas tried to joke, to laugh, but his voice trembled. Jenna kept hugging herself, rocking slightly, muttering that we were not safe, and I couldn't deny it. We stopped briefly at a small clearing to regain composure. The sun had almost disappeared behind the ridge, leaving long shadows clawing across the ground. I stepped out of the van, trying to stretch and calm my nerves. The air smelled damp, like decaying leaves, and something else, smoky, metallic, reminiscent of a distant fire, made my stomach twist. I closed my eyes, tried to focus on the rhythm of my breathing, tried to convince myself that fear was a luxury, a chemical reaction, not a prescient warning. Then it happened. A scream unlike any before. Not a call, not a warped echo, but a pure, unbroken note of terror. It came from the ridge, higher than the treetops, impossibly near and impossibly far at once. My knees buckled, and I nearly fell as my friends shouted and grabbed me. The hair on my arms stood on end. The forest had shifted again, or maybe I had. I couldn't tell. All rational thought fled as the scream repeated, closer this time, surrounding us in a suffocating sphere of sound. We got back into the van, doors locked, windows rolled up. The engine's rumble was deafening compared to the forest's oppressive silence, and yet the echo of that scream lingered in my skull. I could feel it vibrating through my chest. Mark tried to drive, but the narrow path forced us to inch forward, tires crunching over unseen obstacles. Every curve brought another distant exhalation, another impossible cry. Fear sharpened, stabbing at my mind with every heartbeat until my thoughts looped uncontrollably. We are being watched. We are being followed. We are alone. Night fell fully, a suffocating blackness that seemed to press against the van, as if the forest itself were leaning in. We couldn't see the road, only the faint reflections of our headlights glinting off wet leaves. The cries became sporadic, unpredictable, echoing across impossible distances. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind the van, synchronized with our every movement, stopping when we stopped, quickening when we did. My chest tightened with panic, and I wanted to scream, to beg the ridge to leave us alone, but no sound came. Then came a sound that made my stomach drop. Tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, moving along the metal frame of the van. I recognized it instantly from the first night, the calculated percussion of something unseen. My friends shouted, panic rising to match mine. We accelerated, tires skidding over roots, brakes shrieking on rock-strewn dirt, yet the tapping persisted, sliding along the sides, matching our speed with eerie precision. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened. I don't know how long we drove like that, navigating the impossible darkness, trapped in a storm of sound and shadow. The cries, the taps, the phantom footsteps, they all became a living entity pressing down on our minds. I felt my rational self fragment, each logical thought swallowed by a tidal wave of dread. Every instinct screamed to stop, to hide, to fight, yet the van was our only sanctuary. Somewhere in the darkness I realized something terrifying. It wasn't just the forest or the ridge that had trapped us, it was our own fear. Each cry, each tap, each distorted echo was magnified by our minds, amplified by the isolation we had chosen. The ridge was no longer just land, it was a reflection, a mirror of the terror we carried inside, a psychological maze we had willingly entered. We didn't speak much after that. The van rolled forward on a path I barely noticed, headlights cutting through the oppressive night. Occasionally a scream would pierce the air and our bodies would jolt in unison, hearts hammering, muscles taut with panic. Time lost meaning. The road twisted and turned, but the ridge seemed infinite, the forest endless, pressing against us in all directions. Eventually, just as my mind teetered on the edge of collapse, we saw the faint glow of a distant highway, a thin ribbon of civilization slicing through the darkness. Relief surged like a tidal wave, but it was tempered by exhaustion and a lingering, gnawing fear that refused to dissipate. The van sped toward the lights, tires gripping the asphalt as if pulling us back to reality. And yet, even as we crossed the threshold of normalcy, I couldn't shake the echo of those screams, the phantom taps, the way the ridge had reshaped our perception. I have returned to Shenandoah since that October, but I never camped on that ridge again. Sometimes late at night, I close my eyes and hear the distorted calls, feel the rhythm of the tapping, remember the forest pressing close, and I realize that the scariest part of the experience wasn't the unknown beyond the trees. It was what it revealed inside myself. How fragile our grasp on safety and reason becomes when isolation, darkness, and the unknown converge. The ridge taught me that fear can be a companion, a predator, and a mirror. And even now, years later, when I drive past the valleys, I feel the ridge's presence like a shadow behind my eyes, reminding me that some experiences don't end when the daylight comes. I never believed fog could feel like a living thing until that night at Mount Mitchell. My name is Lucas Harlow. I'm 37, and I've spent more years wandering the back roads of the United States in my old Volkswagen camper than I have in any permanent home. There's a strange kind of freedom in driving, where the pavement ends, setting up camp in places most people only pass by on the highway. But that freedom comes with a quiet, gnawing risk that the forest always reminds you of if you're not careful. June 2023 had me heading into North Carolina for a stretch of trails I'd never explored. Mount Mitchell was supposed to be the pinnacle of a peaceful retreat, a spot where the wind whistles through the pines, the streams gurgle gently, and the stars feel like they're close enough to touch. I parked my camper in the official campground, a narrow patch of flattened earth among towering oaks, and spent the first few hours watching the day fade over the ridges. It was hot and humid, the kind of heat that clings to your skin and makes the world feel heavier. And yet, as the sun began its slow descent, the temperature dipped sharply, a coolness rolling down from the mountain that made the hair on my arms prick. At first, the fog was innocent enough. It draped the ridges in a soft white sheet, moving lazily through the trees like a careless wanderer. I unpacked, started a small fire, and told myself I was just being dramatic when a chill ran down my spine, the kind that doesn't belong to the evening air but something else, something unspoken. I shook it off, attributing it to exhaustion from the drive and the long stretch of daylight I had spent navigating tight mountain roads. I reminded myself that every time I camped alone, a little unease was normal. But as the evening settled, the fog thickened unnaturally. It wasn't the playful haze of a summer morning. It was dense, oppressive, crawling over the campground and muffling the sounds I expected to hear. The usual chorus of crickets and distant owls was there, yes, but muted, as if the fog itself had swallowed their voices. I noticed it first when I stepped outside to check the fire. The headlights from my camper barely cut through the white veil. Shapes in the distance seemed to shift as I blinked, branches that looked like limbs, rocks that looked like crouching figures. My instincts whispered at me. Something was off. I tried to rationalize it. Fog on Mount Mitchell could be thick. That was the mountain's nature. Still, I felt it pressing against me, wrapping the entire clearing in a near-solid wall of damp air. I could taste it on my tongue, heavy and metallic, like wet stone. I closed the camper door and lit a candle inside, hoping the small pool of light would make the interior feel like a sanctuary. And for a while it did. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave. It only nestled itself deeper, a quiet hum at the edges of my mind, teasing the nerves that were already fraying from the relentless hum of isolation. I decided to make dinner, something simple, beans and rice. But even the mundane task felt loaded, as if my hands were moving underwater. Each clink of the spoon against the pot sounded too loud, echoing strangely, absorbed then returned in a whispering distortion. The fog pressed closer, visible now through the thin veil of my windshield, twisting and curling around the campsite like it was alive. Shadows moved in patterns that didn't make sense. A rustle behind the camper, subtle but sharp, made me freeze. I told myself it was an animal. The mountain is full of deer, raccoons, maybe a fox. Rationally, I was correct, but that rationality felt brittle. Night deepened, and with it, the fog became almost tactile. I reached for my flashlight, sweeping it around the campsite, watching the beam dissolve into the white nothingness beyond. It was impossible to see more than 20 feet. And yet, through that whiteness, I could feel movement. Not constant, not predictable, but a subtle shifting, like someone or something was pacing just beyond the edges of perception. I called out, my voice cutting through the thick silence, and waited. No answer, just the oppressive fog pressing against my ears, whispering in a language I couldn't quite grasp. Sleep wasn't an option. I sat in my camper, back pressed against the door, listening. The wind had died, replaced by a heavy, almost sentient quiet. Every snap of a twig outside made my heart jump, every creak of my camper frame sounding like footsteps approaching. The Volkswagen, my old companion through countless nights, felt suddenly fragile, like a hollow shell vulnerable to intrusion. I kept imagining eyes in the fog, pale orbs watching, studying me, waiting. And then came the smell. Smoke, but not from my fire. Something faint, acrid, curling around the corners of the camper like it wanted me to notice it, but impossible to locate. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see, and the fog seemed to pulse in response, breathing with the campsite, wrapping everything in its quiet conspiracy. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had begun to fracture, each tick of the clock exaggerated, each shadow sharper, more threatening. I debated calling for help, but where would I call? My phone had one bar, and even then it felt like the mountain itself would intercept the signal, bending it into useless static. I tried to remind myself of the safety of the campground, of the signs that said rangers patrolled here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the fog had rewritten the rules, and now I was playing in a space I didn't understand. The first real panic hit when I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of my headlights, a vague silhouette among the trees. I froze. It didn't move, didn't blink. It just lingered there, and my mind insisted it must be someone else, someone who had entered the campground unnoticed. I remembered stories, whispered among campers, about hikers who wandered into fog and were never seen again. I felt a surge of anger at my own foolishness for being alone, for thinking I could manage the mountain's moods without consequence. I grabbed my keys, ready to start the engine, but hesitation held me. My rational mind screamed that it could be a trick of the fog, a shadow cast oddly by a tree limb or a rock. My fear, though, wasn't rational. It was ancestral, old, and sharp, reminding me that solitude in the wilderness is an invitation if you let it. The silhouette flickered, or maybe it was my eyes, or maybe the fog itself. I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and alien. I whispered my own name to steady myself, a futile attempt to anchor to reality. Hours crawled past, the kind of time that expands and contracts depending on how close danger feels. I didn't sleep, I didn't eat. I simply waited, listening, watching, feeling the fog press against my skin, pressing into my chest. At one point, I thought I heard laughter, soft, almost playful, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. My stomach dropped. I wanted to leave, but the roads were slick from a sudden rain, invisible in the fog, twisting into the dark like serpents. I was trapped, caught between the need for flight and the fear of exposing myself to the unknown outside. Morning arrived without fanfare. The fog had thinned slightly, though not entirely. The forest looked like itself again, mundane, almost boring in its familiarity. I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, the product of fatigue and fear, but the residue remained. Every branch, every rustle of leaves carried the echo of the night before. I packed quickly, the fear still vibrating under my skin, and drove down the mountain with headlights cutting through the lingering mist. Even now, months later, I can close my eyes and feel that fog crawling back, not as a memory, but as a living, waiting presence. Mount Mitchell isn't haunted in the supernatural sense. There was no ghost, no monster, but it reminded me that nature can be an antagonist of its own making. The mountain tested patience, fear, and perception, and I walked away with scars no one can see but me. The lesson was simple. Trust your instincts, respect the terrain, and never assume isolation is safe. And above all, never underestimate the quiet terror that can grow in silence, that can press against you in ways your eyes can't see and your mind can't explain. Even after the mountain fell behind me, the fog didn't leave. It clung to the edges of my mind, a stubborn residue that refused to be shaken off with distance. Driving down the winding roads, I noticed how the air felt heavier than usual, sticky with humidity and the ghost of that previous night. The world outside the windshield seemed sharper, almost painfully so, as though Mount Mitchell had tuned my senses to a frequency that reality itself struggled to reach. Every bend in the road, every shadow that moved with the trees made me flinch. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined most of it, that fatigue had stretched fear into hallucination. But the details refused to be dismissed. The acrid smell that I could never locate, the way the fog had moved almost purposefully, curling around my campsite like a predator circling a prey too stubborn to run. Even recalling it now, I can feel the subtle pressure in my chest, the hum of adrenaline that never fully faded. I stopped at a roadside diner later that morning, hoping the ordinary sounds of coffee brewing and plates clattering would reset me, but my nerves were frayed. Each door that opened and closed, each laugh from a neighboring table, carried a ghost of that isolation I'd endured. By midday, I pulled into a small, almost deserted campground near Asheville, North Carolina, hoping to rest for a few hours and shake off the lingering anxiety. The new site was sunny, open, the kind of place that should have felt safe, and yet, even under the bright light, I couldn't escape the feeling that the fog had followed me in spirit. I unpacked the camper slowly, deliberately, checking the locks, the windows, the structural integrity of my little Volkswagen Fortress. Every sound, the flap of a loose tarp, the rustle of leaves in the wind, made me startle. I began to realize that the night had left more than memories. It had left a residue of hypervigilance, a constant whisper of threat at the edges of perception. I decided to take a walk, hoping that motion and the rational act of movement would clear the heaviness in my mind. The trail was gentle, the forest alive with sunlight, the way the mountains seemed to breathe in the morning air. And yet, as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were following me. Not human eyes, not clearly, but some presence that measured and judged. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was paranoia, that my body was reacting to previous trauma, that I was making patterns out of randomness. Rational thoughts collided with instinct in a messy, uncomfortable friction. By the time I returned to the camper, my nerves were taut. I sat in the driver's seat, hands on the wheel, and forced myself to breathe in slow, deliberate strokes. I reminded myself of the facts. I was alone, the fog was gone, no one had approached me. And yet, even as logic spoke, my body remained in rebellion. Every creak in the camper, every brush of wind against the side mirror sounded like an intruder's movement. I realized that Mount Mitchell hadn't just frightened me, it had changed my perception of solitude. I had always loved isolation, cherished it. Now it was no longer comforting. Now it was a knife edge, thin and sharp. The day wore on, heat rising in waves, and I attempted to eat, though the appetite was lost. My hands shook slightly as I unwrapped a simple sandwich, the crinkle of wax paper sounding unnaturally loud in the open space of the camper. Shadows from the trees leaned and stretched as the sun moved west, making the forest feel unpredictable, unstable. My imagination turned each ordinary branch into a possible threat, each bird call into a signal. I realized bitterly that my mind had become a trap. The night had ended, yes, but its echo had taken residence inside me, waiting to flare into full-blown panic at the slightest cue. By evening, I decided I needed human contact, someone to confirm that the world still made sense. I wandered to the campground office, a small wooden building with peeling paint, expecting the ranger to be cheerful, routine, the embodiment of normalcy. But the office was empty, the sliding door locked, a note tacked to the board with hastily scrawled instructions for emergencies. I felt a creeping irritation at first, then a pulse of unease. This wasn't unusual. Off-season campgrounds often run on skeleton crews, but in my state of mind, the lack of presence, the absence of a reassuring figure, made the space feel precarious, like a stage where danger might quietly step forward. I returned to the camper and sat in silence, listening. The forest was alive with the normal evening chorus of wildlife, yet the normalcy felt wrong. My own heartbeat sounded intrusive, amplified by the stillness. I checked the locks again, the windows, the latches, and then, almost involuntarily, I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure lingering just beyond the frame. Nothing was there, yet the tension didn't leave. I realized I had become conditioned to expect threat, my mind scanning for patterns, for movement, for anomalies in a way I hadn't before. Night fell, and with it, another layer of tension. The sun's absence made every shadow a potential hazard. I didn't sleep for hours, if at all. I thought about Mount Mitchell, about the fog that had trapped me in my own fear, about how the mountain had seemed to breathe, to watch, to press itself into my mind. I thought about every camper I had ever met, every trail I had walked, every quiet night where I had felt secure, and I realized how fragile that security was. It wasn't the mountain that was dangerous. It wasn't the fog. It was the vulnerability that comes with being alone in a vast, untamed space where your senses are all you have to navigate reality. Then a sound shattered the fragile calm I had tried to build. A single knock on the camper door, soft but deliberate, reverberated in the small space. My stomach lurched. I froze, listening. Another knock, louder, more insistent. My mind raced. Visitor? Animal? Intruder? Instinct screamed at me to flee, but reason, though shaky, reminded me that I had keys, that I had doors locked, that panic could make me reckless. I gripped the door handle, inhaled sharply, and slowly eased the door open a crack. Nothing. The campsite was empty, silent except for the whispering leaves. The fog hadn't returned, the wind hadn't shifted, yet the knock had been real, deliberate. My pulse hammered in my ears as I scanned the darkness, and a new fear emerged. Not the primal fear of the mountain, but the creeping terror of uncertainty. The knowledge that your mind can be betrayed by your own senses. I spent the remainder of the night sitting upright, flashlight in hand, listening for any sound, any movement, any clue that I wasn't alone. Every rustle, every whisper of wind set off a cascade of adrenaline. My body was taut, every muscle ready to react, yet every instinct screamed at me to stay calm, to reason, to survive. Hours dragged like days. When the first pale light of dawn finally cut through the trees, I was drained, hollowed out by fear, but still alive. The knocking had vanished, leaving only the echo in my mind. Packing up that morning, I moved quickly but cautiously, aware of every shadow, every rustle. I left no trace of my lingering fear, no sign that the night had tested me so thoroughly. Driving away, I tried to reflect, to rationalize, to extract some lesson from the ordeal. And I found one, sharp and unyielding. The wilderness is not cruel in a conventional sense, but it is honest. It does not comfort. It does not lie. It reveals the fragile boundaries between safety and danger, between reason and instinct, and it exposes the parts of ourselves we most like to ignore. Even now, whenever I close my eyes and breathe deeply, I can feel the fog pressing against me, curling around my ribs, whispering that I am small, that I am alone, that I am subject to forces I cannot control. It is a reminder that fear is not always about the obvious threat. It is about the quiet, persistent doubt that seeps into your mind, the suspicion that you might be walking blindly into danger. The night at Mount Mitchell taught me that preparedness is not just about supplies or skill. It is about awareness, about trust in your instincts, about the courage to respect the invisible boundaries that the natural world sets. Mount Mitchell didn't teach me a story of monsters or ghosts. It taught me a story about myself, about how quickly the mind can turn routine into terror, how a single night of fog can reshape the way you perceive solitude, and how fragile the line is between comfort and panic when isolation stretches around you like a living, breathing entity. I left the mountain wiser, yes, but also wary, knowing that the next time I set up camp in the backcountry, I would carry not just my gear, but the shadow of that night, the memory of a fog that refused to leave, and the knowledge that vigilance is both armor and burden. I remember the road like it was a living thing, twisting through the darkened hollows of North Carolina with an almost deliberate patience as if it knew exactly where it wanted to lead me. My name is Lucas. I'm 34, and I've spent enough nights in an RV to know the difference between a quiet forest and a forest that's quietly watching you. That December evening in 2021, I was rolling south of Bryson City in my old Volkswagen camper van, the heater rattling and sputtering, casting weak warmth across the cabin as frost crept along the edges of the windshield. The road was empty, too empty, and the mountains on either side seemed to press closer as the sun sank behind them. I remember telling myself I was imagining things, that the wind whistling through the trees was just that, wind. But my gut had already started whispering a warning I wasn't ready to hear. I had planned a short detour from my usual route. a last-minute choice to take a quieter back road that promised secluded camping according to a forum I'd skimmed earlier that week. The air smelled sharp and cold, that mixture of wet pine and decaying leaves, and it seemed to cling to the inside of the van in a way that made the small space feel both insulated and exposed at the same time. I liked the isolation, usually, most of the time. But there was a shift, subtle at first, like the way a familiar song hits a note slightly off-key, and suddenly it's all you can hear. It was just after dusk when I saw her. At first, she was nothing more than a silhouette, a figure standing on the roadside, framed by the pale glow of my headlights. She didn't wave, didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. Her stance was rigid, almost deliberate, as if she had been waiting for me. The road had been completely empty for miles, and yet here she was, motionless and silent. My instinct told me to slow down, but curiosity held me hostage. That terrible mix of fear and fascination that makes you want to look closer even when you know you shouldn't. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice breaking slightly despite my efforts to keep it steady. Nothing, just the quiet hum of the van and the occasional creak of the heater. She didn't flinch, didn't move. It was unnatural how still she was, like she had somehow merged with the shadows at the roadside. I rationalized it. I tried to tell myself she was probably someone stranded, maybe lost, maybe needing help. Common sense clashed with intuition, and I felt that classic tension. The fear that screams at you, "Get away," while every rational thought says, "Do the right thing." I pulled over a few feet ahead, the tires crunching over frost-hardened leaves. The headlights illuminated her more clearly now. She was young, probably in her early 20s, dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild December night, her hair dark and stringy, hanging loose around her pale face. The kind of pale that looks almost translucent in headlights. My chest tightened. I told myself again that I needed to stay calm, offer help, maybe drive her to town, make it quick, make it simple. But every instinct in my body, the tiny hairs on the back of my neck, the ache in my stomach told me that this wasn't a simple encounter. I cracked the window just a fraction. "Hey, do you need a ride?" My words sounded loud and sharp in the enclosed space. Still nothing. Not a blink, not a twitch, not a whisper. I remember the way the silence pressed back, thicker than the fog starting to roll down the mountainside. There was a smell in the air then, subtle, faint, but wrong, like wet earth and something else, something metallic. My mind tried to label it, tried to rationalize it, but it only made the tension coiter around my chest. I told myself to move on. I needed to leave. But as I shifted the van into gear, the figure moved, not toward me, not away, but along the edge of the road, keeping pace with the van. Not running, just matching speed. My heartbeat doubled. I had no intention of chasing anything. I wasn't a hero. I was just a guy trying to find a quiet spot to camp. And yet here she was, silently matching every inch of my progress, unhurried, unblinking, perfectly synchronized with the rhythm of my vehicle. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, the trees looming dark and endless, but she appeared there too, somehow closer now, though I hadn't slowed. A trick of the light? A trick of my mind? I don't know. What I do know is that my stomach sank and the warmth from the heater felt suddenly inadequate, as if it couldn't protect me from something that wasn't entirely physical. I decided finally to pull off completely. I turned the van onto a narrow side road that led toward a small, forested campsite I had scouted earlier that week. Gravel crunched under the tires, muffling the sense of urgency I felt building inside me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, pulse hammering. And then I saw her again, standing at the fork where I had just turned, motionless, silent, perfectly still against the dark. That's when the creeping dread fully set in. Not just a fear of the unknown, but a fear of recognition, of someone or something, watching, waiting, calculating. My mind raced through scenarios, every one of them worse than the last. I rationalized, I denied, I tried to convince myself she was harmless, but rational thought doesn't hold much weight when your body is screaming, "Run." I parked at the edge of the campsite, leaving the van running. My plan was simple: wait until she left, or if she didn't, retreat back the way I came. I grabbed a flashlight, checking the perimeter, every snap of a twig underfoot or rustle in the trees, twisting my stomach into tighter knots. The campsite, which had seemed inviting in daylight, felt alien now, each shadow a potential threat, every beam of the flashlight bouncing off the trunks in unexpected angles. I felt like I was intruding into a space that had no interest in harboring me. Minutes dragged, long and torturous. I told myself again to stay calm. That voice, the one in my head that usually narrates my adventures with ease, was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only the sharp, insistent rhythm of my own fear. And then, finally, I saw her again, not near the road, not at the fork, but crouched behind a tree at the far edge of the clearing. I couldn't tell if she had moved there slowly, silently, or if my mind had simply decided that's where she would be. I froze. And then I realized I had been holding my breath. Something inside me snapped. I ran back to the van, throwing the door open, heart hammering, hands shaking, and started the engine. The Volkswagen roared in protest as I shifted into reverse, then quickly into drive, tires skidding slightly on the frost-hardened gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't slow. The mountains, the trees, the empty road, they all blurred past me in a chaotic smear of shadow and cold air. Even after I had put miles between myself and that roadside, that campsite, that silent figure, the unease didn't leave me. The road felt alive, stretching out endlessly, whispering the same warning I had ignored. The forested hills on either side seemed to lean closer, reminding me of how small, how exposed I had been. And yet, beneath the fear, beneath the racing pulse and cold sweat, there was a lesson forming, quiet and insistent. Instinct is not paranoia. It's a survival tool you ignore at your peril. When I finally stopped at a lit gas station in a town I didn't recognize, I checked the van, checked the surroundings, but there was nothing. No trace of her, no footprints, no lingering shadow. Just the smell of exhaust and the sterile warmth of fluorescent lights. I wanted to convince myself I had imagined it, that my mind, tired and isolated, had conjured something terrifying out of nothing. But I couldn't. Not fully. Because the memory of those silent, unblinking eyes stayed with me, long after the cold North Carolina night had faded from my body, long after the road became just asphalt and lines again. And that night, as I parked somewhere safe, the heater finally steady, I realized that RV camping is not just about solitude or escape. It's about listening to the road, to the forest, to the small, insistent voice that tells you when something is off. Because sometimes the danger isn't a storm or a broken axle or a wrong turn. Sometimes it's the quiet things that follow you, that match your pace, that watch without ever moving, and remind you that isolation is a fragile, fragile thing. Even as the town lights faded behind me and I merged back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles whitening as the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt sounded. Wrong somehow. Too steady. Too deliberate. The wind rattled the van's frame, whispering through the edges of the doors and windows, but I didn't even notice it at first. I was listening for her. Not consciously, of course. My mind told me I was imagining things, yet every shadow along the roadside seemed elongated, leaning toward me, and every flicker of light through the trees looked like a signal, a marker of her silent presence. I tried to rationalize. She had to be gone. I was moving faster now, past towns I didn't know, through stretches of road bordered by dense, dark forests. The cold air from the cracked window burned my lungs, my breath misting in the van like smoke, and still I felt eyes, watching, unblinking, patient. I told myself to focus on the road, to focus on anything else. The hum of the engine, the red glow of the taillights, the fog creeping across the asphalt. But no matter how much I tried, my mind kept returning to her face, pale and still, framed by the beams of my headlights. I pulled into a rest stop after what felt like hours, shaking uncontrollably as I killed the engine. I sat there, van idling silently, staring out at the empty parking lot, wondering if I was safe or if I'd merely traded one nightmare for another. And then without warning, I heard it. A soft, deliberate tap on the side of the van. My stomach lurched into my throat. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain anyone or anything outside would hear it. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to drive off, but my body was locked in place, frozen by the pure, incomprehensible terror of recognition. The tap came again. 3 sharp, distinct knocks. No wind could make that sound. No falling branch could hit the van with such rhythm. My pulse became a drum in my ears as my rational mind clawed desperately for an explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank, maybe it was a local, but then my eyes, wild and unblinking, caught the movement in the reflection of the passenger side mirror. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. Slow, deliberate, watching, waiting. I started the van again, slamming it into drive, tires screeching on the asphalt as adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't dare glance behind me. I only knew what I felt, that undeniable, stomach-twisting sense of being hunted, of being observed with a patience that made your skin crawl. And as the van accelerated into the empty night, the rest stop faded behind me like a half-remembered nightmare. Yet the memory of her, silent and unmoving, clung to me like frost on a window pane. By the time I reached the next town, a small cluster of lights and life that offered some fleeting comfort, I was shaking, my hands slick with sweat despite the cold. I parked under a street lamp, hoping the illumination would keep the shadows at bay, if only temporarily. I kept glancing over my shoulder, over my mirrors, scanning every flicker, every shape, and still, the memory of her figure lingered like a phantom imprint. Sleep was impossible. The van, my supposed sanctuary, now felt like a trap, each creak and groan of the frame amplified into a chorus of suspicion. Every noise from the surrounding area made me jump. The distant bark of a dog, the rattle of loose signage in the wind, the rustle of leaves, but nothing concrete, nothing tangible. Just the quiet, insistent pressure of fear crawling up my spine. And yet, even amidst this terror, I found myself analyzing every detail, every micro-expression I could remember from that roadside encounter. She hadn't moved aggressively, she hadn't said a word, and yet the presence she carried was enough to make rational thought tremble. The next morning, I forced myself to leave the town. The sun, pale and hesitant, did little to alleviate the lingering dread. The road stretched ahead, still empty, still pressing against me with an almost sentient weight. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I kept checking the mirrors obsessively, scanning every curve and clearing in the woods. My mind began to warp the details. Each shadow grew taller, each tree seemed to lean toward me, and the edges of the road blurred into shapes that could be figures, could be tricks of the morning light. I finally decided to pull into a larger, busier campground near Bryson City, reasoning that numbers, noise, and lights would keep whatever had haunted me at bay. I parked, trying to act casual, though my hands trembled as I disconnected the van from the main road. Campers walked past, dogs barking, voices carrying in a way that felt alien to me after the relentless silence of the previous night. For a moment, I thought I might actually be safe, but then the feeling returned. The pressure at the edges of perception, the subtle tug that made my stomach twist and my pulse spike. I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow, too still, too precise. My breath caught. I turned sharply, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing, just trees, trailers, and the flickering lights of a campfire. I told myself it was exhaustion, the mind playing tricks, yet my instincts screamed differently. There was something about the way shadows fell that night that didn't belong to natural light. Something deliberate, something watching. Hours passed like this, a torturous stretch of uncertainty. I tried to convince myself to sleep, to let the heater hum lull me into some fragile sense of normalcy. But when I finally drifted, the dream was no escape. I dreamt of her silhouette along the road, closer each time, silent and patient. The dream was vivengible. And when I awoke to the van rocking slightly, I realized with a jolt that part of me still expected her to be there. The forest outside seemed alive again, breathing with intent, shadows stretching longer than they had any right to. I didn't stay long. That morning I packed quickly, fueled by a mixture of fear and resolve. The van roared to life, carrying me away from the campsite, down roads that seemed to twist more sharply than memory allowed. Yet even as the miles accumulated, a part of me never fully relaxed. The encounter had shifted something inside me. The world felt less predictable, less safe. My instincts, once easy to ignore in pursuit of adventure, had become a lens I couldn't remove. In the days that followed, every trip, every campsite, every quiet roadside carried a shadow of that night. I analyzed every sound, the snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees, the way headlights cut through fog, looking for signs, for reassurance, for the impossible knowledge that what I had felt was real. And the truth was undeniable. The fear hadn't been imagined. She had been there. Silent, watching, patient. And even if I never saw her again, the memory of her presence had marked me, taught me that the quietest threats often leave the deepest scars. Looking back now, months later, I realized that night on the road near Bryson City was less about the figure herself and more about the vulnerability that comes with isolation. The dread I felt wasn't a story for thrill or exaggeration. It was real. Every camper, every traveler, every solitary soul on the road carries that same fragile thread of exposure. And sometimes that thread is tested by things we cannot rationalize, things that force us to listen to instincts we might otherwise ignore. The road taught me something that night, that vigilance is not paranoia, that fear can be a teacher, and that silent figures on the roadside, quiet shadows in the woods, often speaks louder than words ever could. I've learned to honor that voice, to respect it, and to understand that the world is far larger, far stranger, and far less forgiving than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. And so, as I continue to wander, RV packed and headlights cutting through darkness, I carry with me both a caution and a reverence. For every empty road, every isolated campsite, and every shadow that lingers just beyond the edge of sight reminds me of the silent lesson I learned that December night. That fear, when faced, is not the enemy. It is the signal, the compass, the quiet whisper that guides you through darkness you can see and darkness you cannot. I remember the first night like it was a living thing, pressing against me from all sides. The sun had just dipped below the ridges of Pisgah National Forest, casting long, trembling shadows across the campsite, and I felt an unfamiliar knot of anticipation in my chest. My name is Ethan Carver, I'm 34, and I've been RV camping all over the eastern United States for more than a decade. But that July evening in 2020, something about the forest didn't feel like the other forests I knew. The air smelled richer, heavier, like the trees themselves were breathing, and the murmurs of distant streams seemed to ripple in tandem with my pulse. I had parked my old Volkswagen camper van near a small, winding stream that glinted like quicksilver under the fading light. The forest was alive with sound, the hum of cicadas, the occasional rustle of leaves, but there was something uneven in it, an almost imperceptible pause in the rhythm that kept drawing my attention. I shook it off as imagination at first. You always tell yourself it's the imagination because rationality is easier to cling to than admitting you're scared of the dark, quiet woods. I was unpacking supplies when I noticed the eyes. I froze, thinking they were reflections of the camp lantern, or perhaps the glint of moonlight on wet stones, but no. They were small, amber, and unblinking, peering at me from the dense underbrush near the stream's edge. Every instinct screamed to run, to slam the van doors and retreat, but curiosity kept me rooted. I watched them shift, faintly glinting whenever I moved. At first, I thought it was deer. Too many stories of curious deer watching campers. But their positioning, the way they didn't move in a pattern I recognized, it was wrong. I called out softly, hoping my voice would ease whatever presence lingered in the brush. Hello? Nothing, just the stream's gentle gurgle, but the eyes stayed. I could feel their gaze brushing against me, weighing me down, and a tight knot began forming behind my sternum. My heart picked up, uneven, irregular, like a hand drumming against the inside of my ribs. As the night deepened, the noises of the forest changed. At first, it was only the wind through the pines, the normal scratching and flitting of small creatures. But slowly, subtle anomalies began asserting themselves. A paw scratch here, a low hiss there, just beyond where the firelight reached. Shadows seemed to stretch too far, leaves falling silently where no branch could have reached them. I kept telling myself, Ethan, it's nothing. You're imagining things. You're alone, the van is secure, you've been camping 1,000 nights. Still, the unease grew. I noticed footprints near the water, small, feline-like, but elongated, not quite right. They led to the stream, dipped in the shallow water, and then vanished as though they had been swallowed by the shadows themselves. My rational mind tried to explain them. Raccoons, stray dogs, maybe a bobcat passing through. But the rhythm of my breathing betrayed me. My skin prickled every time I turned my head toward the tree line, expecting movement that never quite came. I went inside the van to make tea, shaking slightly as I lit the stove. Even there, the feeling didn't leave. The tiny hum of the propane burner seemed too loud, echoing in the metal shell of the van. Outside, the stream whispered secrets I couldn't understand, and the eyes, they hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, had simply stayed. My grip tightened on the mug, and I forced myself to sip, the warmth steadying my hands but failing to touch the growing dread in my chest. Hours passed, the kind that stretch and elongate in silence, each tick of the clock a drumbeat against my nerves. I tried to sleep, laying my head on the worn pillow, but every sound, a twig snapping, leaves brushing together, made me tense, my body poised for flight that would never come. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate step, not on the forest floor, but near the van. Slow, measured, unnatural. My stomach clenched. No one should be out here this late. I told myself that, but the voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. I peeked through the curtain, heart thundering, expecting a trespasser or a lost hiker. Nothing. Only the faint shimmer of the stream and the dark line of trees. Yet, in that darkness, I could swear I saw movement at the periphery. Quick, fluid, eyes glinting back at me just long enough to vanish. It was the same gaze I had noticed before, the same that had followed me from the underbrush. Panic whispered in my ears, a soft, insidious voice urging me to run, to escape the forest before it knew how weak I was. Sleep eventually took me, but only in fitful, shallow spurts, each dream a distorted echo of the forest. Amber eyes reflecting in water, shadows stretching impossibly long, whispers threading through the trees. When morning came, the sun breaking through the canopy in fragmented beams, I felt both relief and hesitation. Relief that night had ended, hesitation that the forest had allowed me to leave, and that its eyes, whatever they belonged to, had not left. I spent the day hiking nearby trails, trying to shake the residue of fear clinging to my skin. But the forest seemed complicit in my unease. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of twig reminded me of the previous night. I saw deer, squirrels, and birds behaving normally, yet at the same time, other movements, subtle, jerking, always just beyond clear view, kept me on edge. I began to notice patterns in their behavior. Small animals pausing abruptly, birds taking flight simultaneously, the occasional howl of a distant predator, timed as if in response to my presence. I realized that whatever watched me was attuned to me in a way that felt personal. The idea was ridiculous, and yet the forest seemed to confirm it, pressing, bending, whispering. I reminded myself again, it's the wild. Wild things are unpredictable. Wild things aren't supernatural. Rationality was a thin veil, but it was all I had. That night, I tried a new strategy. Leaving the van, I set up a small campfire at the edge of the clearing and sat as far as I could from the stream, keeping my back to a tree. I wanted to observe without being observed, but that night I learned the forest has a patience unlike ours. Hours passed, shadows moving just beyond the glow of firelight, and every crackle of the flames seemed to announce my presence to whatever was out there. The eyes returned, amber, unmoving, positioned in different locations each time I glanced up. Sleep came again in shallow waves, dreams threading into waking thoughts. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active, watchful presence, something that mirrored my own apprehension and fed on it. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of water lapping, not from the stream but seemingly closer, circling the van in soft, deliberate splashes. My heart raced, and I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the perimeter. Nothing but the trees, but the angle of the moonlight reflected in something small, wet, and glinting. Eyes. Amber eyes, unblinking, staring straight at me. I realized then that the forest demanded respect, attentiveness, and humility. It doesn't yield to arrogance. I had thought of myself as an experienced camper, someone who could read the forest as easily as a map, but Pisgah National Forest had taught me otherwise. There is a subtle terror in understanding that you are never truly alone, even in solitude. And there is a deeper terror in noticing that you can't always see the watchers clearly, that they can wait patiently for your nerves to unravel, letting you imagine threats or not imagine them at all. By the third night, I had adopted a rigid routine, movements rehearsed, my senses sharpened to the smallest anomaly. Footsteps, rustling leaves, reflections in water, subtle shifts in shadows. Every detail mattered. I slept with a knife within reach, my phone ready, the van doors locked. But the fear was not only external, it was in me, in my hesitation, in the way I flinched at the smallest sound. The forest had infiltrated my mind, shaping my perception, molding my anxiety into a tangible thing that I carried as I moved through the clearing, across the stream, and up the winding trails. By the fourth evening, I could feel the forest's rhythm in my bones. The sun had dipped earlier than I realized, shadows thickening as if they had weight. My campsite, once a small haven of familiarity, had become a nerve center, every corner of the clearing mapped in my mind for safety. Yet the stream, constant, silvered, alive, remained the focal point of my unease. That night, I sat outside the van longer than usual, the fire sputtering low, trying to observe without being observed, but every glance toward the water made my stomach tighten. The eyes had multiplied, not physically, but in their presence. Every time I looked away and then back, there was a new reflection glinting along the stream's edge, sometimes high in the brush, sometimes near smooth stones, always just enough to suggest movement. It was subtle, almost imperceptible if I blinked or turned my head too quickly, but my body registered it instantly. My chest ached from tension, from the awareness that I was being measured, timed, watched. I tried to rationalize it, forced myself into explanations, a trick of the moonlight, the reflections of insects on the water, maybe even my own nerves playing against me. But rationality was failing. The forest had a voice, not loud, not literal, but it spoke through silence, through expectation. My every movement seemed amplified, my presence announced in ways I couldn't control. I could feel the creature's attention in the tiny hairs on my arms, in the tightening grip of my hands around the mug, in the way my heartbeat seemed to echo in my ears. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath. Slowly exhaling, I tried to focus on the sounds of the forest, the stream's gentle gurgle, the occasional call of an owl. But the patterns were wrong. Birds calling in intervals that didn't match natural timing, leaves rustling without wind, small scuttling sounds just beyond the firelight. Each instant seemed ordinary on its own, but together they wove a subtle, omnipresent tension I couldn't escape. And then came the sounds that made my skin crawl. The soft, deliberate splashes in the stream, as if something was wading back and forth just beneath the surface. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the rhythm was undeniable, careful, measured, almost deliberate. I could no longer ignore it. I stood peering into the darkness, flashlight in hand, scanning the rippling water. The beam caught a flash, amber eyes, low in the brush, reflecting a light that shouldn't have been there. My heart leapt, but the reflection vanished as quickly as it appeared. Sleep became impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the eyes appeared, floating, shifting, mirroring my anxiety. The shadows behind my eyelids morphed into shapes I couldn't identify, elongated, feline, but human-like in their patience. I caught myself listening for patterns in the noises, trying to understand them and predict them, but there were none. Only the forest, patient, calculating, as if it was testing the limits of my nerves, measuring how long it would take before I betrayed fear in motion. By the 5th day, I had begun to notice behaviors that made my stomach twist. Small animals seemed to act in unison, reacting not to each other, but to my movements. Birds froze mid-flight when I paused. Deer shifted uneasily, even when hidden from my sight. Footprints appeared where none should have been. Tiny, elongated, pressed into the muddy banks of the stream, then disappearing, as if erased deliberately. It wasn't just that I felt watched anymore. It was that the forest responded to me, as though my presence dictated its rhythm. I attempted to document it, notes, sketches, photographs, but every time I tried, something interfered. A branch would fall, scattering the papers. Light reflections would mask the prints in photos. Even video seemed altered, strange distortions when I replayed clips. At one point, I swore I caught a fleeting movement in the corner of the frame, a figure low to the ground, eyes glinting. It was gone before I could point it out to myself. Rationality faltered again, replaced by a gnawing suspicion. I was no longer observing the forest was observing me. The nights stretched longer than days, dragging fear along in their shadows. I could hear footsteps circling the van, always soft, always deliberate, sometimes paired with splashes in the stream. My sleeping bag became a cocoon of both safety and imprisonment. And I found myself resisting the temptation to peek, to verify if the eyes were still there. But curiosity was stronger than fear, and time and again, I would look, and always see them, just for a moment. Amber eyes that held nothing, yet somehow everything. On the 6th night, I tried a different tactic. I left the van again, keeping my fire low, attempting to remain still in the clearing. I convinced myself that if I didn't move, didn't disturb the air, maybe the forest would consider me invisible. But as I sat, I began noticing patterns in the reflections. Small, rhythmic, almost communicating. Each flicker along the stream seemed timed with my movements. Step forward, glance back, sigh. It was a cruel mimicry of my actions. Panic set in. My body wanted to flee, but my mind was riveted, analyzing, trying to understand, trying to make sense of a situation that defied logic. Hours passed in that frozen state, and eventually exhaustion pulled me toward shallow sleep beside the fire. In dreams, the reflections multiplied, forming grids, webs, networks of amber eyes that moved in tandem with my breath. I woke suddenly to the sound of water, this time closer, almost beneath me. My heart throbbed violently as I shone the flashlight toward the stream. For the first time, I noticed movement in the water itself, not the ripple of fish or the sway of weeds, but something deliberate and smooth, like a predator circling prey. The eyes were not on the banks this time. They were in the stream, reflecting the dim moonlight in a way that made my stomach churn. I knew then that my earlier observations had underestimated them. Whatever watched me could move as silently as it pleased, could vanish and reappear at will, and its patience was infinite. I felt simultaneously insignificant and hyper-aware, caught in a net of fear that was both external and internal. My thoughts raced. Should I stay? Should I flee immediately? Could I even escape? And then, as if answering my dread, the water stilled. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my chest like a weight. The forest was waiting for me to act, and the pressure was unbearable. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed awake, wrapped in blankets, flashlight in hand, every nerve on edge. The moments stretched endlessly. At times I heard nothing, only the subtle creaking of trees and the distant echo of the stream. Other times, small movements, slight, deliberate, would catch my attention, and I would catch my breath, stomach knotting, pulse racing. By dawn, I was shaking, exhausted, but strangely exhilarated. I had survived, yes, but I had also realized that my understanding of the forest, of wildlife, of my own instincts, had been forever altered. That morning, I packed slowly, deliberately, leaving the campsite as intact as possible. Every glance toward the stream made my heart leap. The eyes were gone, or perhaps they had always been, and now I was leaving. I couldn't tell which frightened me more, their presence or the possibility that they had never been. As I drove down the winding trails in my Volkswagen camper van, I felt the forest's weight lift slightly, though the impression lingered, etched in my mind. I would never forget the way it had watched, measured, and mirrored my fear. I left Pisgah National Forest with a new respect, a deeper understanding of the subtle, often invisible rhythms of nature. Fear, I realized, isn't always about being attacked. Sometimes it's about recognition that we are not the only consciousness in our environment, that even the smallest movement is noted, mirrored, and at times challenged. I learned to listen more closely, to observe more attentively, and to honor the intelligence of creatures, wild, patient, and precise, without underestimating them. Even now, months later, when I close my eyes and think of that stream, I see amber reflections glinting in the water. Not threatening, not overtly aggressive, but patient, knowing, and infinitely aware. It's a reminder that in the wilderness, we are never truly alone, and sometimes the eyes watching you teach lessons far deeper than any human companion could. I never thought a single knock could unravel a person's sense of safety. But that morning, as I backed my VW camper onto the narrow gravel of the Roan mountain campground, something in the crisp February air already felt off, and I didn't know why. My name is Elliot, I'm 34, and I've been RV camping across the Appalachian highlands for years, chasing quiet solitude, mountain air, and the faint thrill of isolation that only winter campgrounds can deliver. I've met bears, rogue raccoons, and more barking dogs than I can count, but nothing prepared me for what would unfold here. The ascent up the winding road to the campsite was easy at first. Frost clung to the edges of the pine needles, sparkling in the morning sun like shards of glass. My little Volkswagen seemed to hum a contented note as I settled into the narrow pull-out spot assigned to me. A corner lot tucked between two skeletal oaks, one of which leaned precariously over the lane, its shadow stretching across the gravel like a long finger. I parked, extended the little steps, and exhaled, the cold air biting my lungs in a way that reminded me I was alive. By midday, the campground was a quiet, almost reverent hush. I left the camper to wander along a faint trail that led into the lower slopes, my boots crunching over a mix of frost and pine needles. There were tracks in the mud, small, canine-like, though I couldn't be sure. A chill raced down my spine for no reason I could name. The forest around me was alive in ways that were familiar yet subtly hostile. The wind carried a whisper through the branches, a sound I initially dismissed as the usual winter rustle. But as I moved further, the air seemed to tighten, pressing against my ears and chest. Each snap of a twig felt amplified, each distant bird call uncanny. I tried to shake it off. The woods were just woods. I was alone, but not truly vulnerable. Yet the further I hiked, the more the environment seemed to watch me, to respond to my presence with deliberate, almost sentient silence. I remember pausing on a small ridge, looking down at the mist curling through the hollows below. The valley seemed to exhale, a slow, wet fog that crept toward me like a tide. I felt an almost physical weight of attention, as if something or someone was observing, waiting. My heart picked up its own rhythm, a muted drum that I couldn't quiet. Returning to the campsite, I tried to dismiss the feeling with routine. I unpacked the essentials: water, a few canned meals, my notebook. I even set a small fire in the portable stove, the first real warmth I had felt all day. But as dusk fell, a subtle tension began to weave itself into the fabric of my evening. The sky darkened quickly at this altitude, and shadows from the nearby trees stretched long across my VW, swallowing it in jagged darkness. I could hear the occasional rustle from the underbrush. A squirrel or a rabbit, I reasoned, but then something heavier shifted just beyond my vision, an almost imperceptible thud against the side of the camper. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. There was no wind strong enough to knock a branch in that spot, and the sound had come from the camper itself. Yet it was not a tap on the door. It was deeper, resonant, almost like the vehicle had been struck from the outside. I pressed my ear against the metal. Nothing. My pulse throbbed in my temples. I told myself it was a loose panel, maybe frost contracting, anything but acknowledgement that something or someone was there. I returned to my small fire, more vigilant now, each snap of the stove flame punctuating the mounting unease. Night fell fully, and with it came the true depth of the forest's watchfulness. Shadows pooled under the trees, dense and formless, and every sound seemed to double, then triple in my perception. My mind replayed the thud against the camper, again and again, searching for rational explanations. I tried to sleep, curling into my small bed, the VW's walls creaking under the cold. But then it happened again, a soft knock, not from the door, not anywhere I could locate, yet unmistakable. My breath caught, and for a moment I couldn't move. I stayed frozen, telling myself it was impossible. The mind plays tricks, I thought. You're alone. You're safe. Yet the instinctual part of me, the part that has survived wild animals and treacherous trails, insisted I pay attention. I grabbed my flashlight and crept outside, scanning the perimeter, the beam cutting through the night. Every bush, every seemed innocent, yet menacing. Nothing. Only the wind teasing the tips of the pines. I went back inside, locking the small latch on the door, telling myself this was where reason lived. Morning brought no relief. The forest seemed brighter, but the air carried a metallic edge, almost like anticipation. I attempted another hike, this time sticking closer to the paths marked on the trail map. My mind replayed every sound, every fleeting movement. As I walked, I noticed subtle signs I hadn't paid attention to before. Small piles of leaves shifted, tiny dents in the snow like someone had pressed something heavy against it. I kept moving, telling myself I was seeing patterns where none existed. And yet, a sense of being followed, of observed steps echoing my own, gnawed at me steadily. By the time I returned to my camper, I was exhausted, tense, and more aware of the environment than I ever had been. I spent the afternoon inside, reading and attempting to steady my nerves, yet every shadow that crossed the small walls of my VW seemed significant, deliberate. Around 5, as the light softened, the wind picked up again, brushing the side of the camper in a way that carried a wet, hollow sound. And then a knock. Harder this time, resonant as though something pressed a fist against the metal with intention. I froze, my mind blanking, instincts screaming. I debated leaving, packing immediately, but there was nowhere to go in the dark that would guarantee more safety than the VW itself. I sat, holding the flashlight, my knuckles white, listening. Another thud, and then silence. I don't remember when I drifted into sleep, but I woke with the first hint of light cutting through the blinds. My nerves were frayed, the echo of those knocks vibrating in my chest. The next day, I explored further trails, attempting rational distraction, but I noticed that the forest itself seemed subtly altered. The angles of trees, the way the fog lingered in pockets of the valley, the smells of pine resin mingled with something metallic, almost iron-like. I kept my eyes open, ears straining. The snow underfoot occasionally betrayed me, revealing faint tracks that did not match any animal I knew. I followed them cautiously, each step amplifying the inner conflict I felt, the desire to understand, to rationalize, clashing with the creeping suspicion that I was not alone. Evening fell again, colder than before. I lit my small stove, heating a simple meal, aware of every shadow that flickered against the camper walls. That night, the knocks returned. 3 distinct, deliberate raps against the side of the VW, sharp, precise, unlike the random thumps of branches. My stomach turned. I gripped the flashlight like a weapon, yet my body felt frozen, caught in the tension of not knowing whether to confront or flee. And then, silence. Hours of silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the camper settling against the frost-hardened ground. I spent the night wide-eyed listening. Every scrape, every rustle felt deliberate. My mind conjured explanations, each more terrifying than the last. By the time dawn broke, I realized that the fear was no longer just about the external. Something inside me had shifted. The forest, The mountain, the VW itself, had become a mirror of my internal state. Tense, suspicious, haunted by echoes I could neither confirm nor deny. I packed carefully that morning, each sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. And as I pulled away from the campsite, I felt the mountain watching, a silent witness to my unraveling composure. The drive down the winding mountain road should have brought relief, but it didn't. Every curve, every shadow cast by the skeletal trees along the edge of the cliff felt alive, pressing close as if the mountain itself had taken notice of me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles whitening in the cold, and the hum of the Volkswagen's engine seemed too loud in the silent winter morning. I kept expecting to hear that knock again, to feel the inexplicable impact that had haunted my nights, but for now, there was only the road and the fog curling through the hollows below. I found a small pullout overlooking the valley and stopped. The fog hung low, dripping along the ridges, curling around the pines like the slow exhale of some immense creature. I stepped out of the camper, boots crunching over frostbitten gravel, and tried to shake the lingering tension. The air was cold, metallic, and carried that same strange iron scent I had noticed yesterday. I inhaled deeply, trying to convince myself it was just the mountain, the soil, the thawing snow. And yet, the instinctive part of me, the part that survived alone in the wild, refused to accept that explanation. Hiking seemed like the only option to regain some sense of control. I followed a trail that led deeper into the forest, the path winding and barely maintained, with thin layers of snow masking hidden roots and rocks. My legs burned with exertion, but the physical strain distracted me from the persistent, gnawing tension in my mind. Branches creaked above, the occasional raptor call echoing hollowly across the ridges, and for a moment I almost believed the forest had returned to ordinary quiet. Almost. I rounded a bend and saw something that froze me mid-step. A tree, gnarled, ancient, leaned sharply to one side, its trunk scarred with long, deep scratches that ran unevenly up its bark. They were too deliberate to be natural, too deep for a clawed animal, and the spacing suggested something deliberate, intentional. My chest tightened and my fingers brushed against the cold metal of my pocket knife. I wanted to rationalize, to dismiss it as fallen branches or animal behavior, yet my gut screamed otherwise. The trail continued upward, and I forced myself to keep moving, one foot in front of the other, heart hammering. The wind shifted suddenly, and a low, wet groan carried through the trees, a sound that was neither animal nor mechanical. I froze, straining to identify its source, my mind looping through every possibility. The forest seemed to press in on all sides, branches brushing my coat with a deliberate touch, the snow muffling my steps till they felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. When I finally returned to the VW that afternoon, the tension hadn't lifted. The camper sat in quiet repose, but the air felt thicker, almost viscous, as though the mountain had exhaled and held its breath in anticipation. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, checking water, preparing a simple meal, but my attention kept snapping back to the thud, the knock that hadn't come from the door, the vague sense that the walls themselves were listening. Every creak, every metal groan of the camper sounded amplified, each echo a reminder that I was utterly exposed. Night fell again, darker and heavier than the previous evening. Frost formed along the edges of the camper roof, sparkling in the faint light of the moon, and shadows pooled under the trees like black ink spilled across the ground. I tried to settle, curling into the narrow bed, but the tension had embedded itself too deeply. Then it came. 3 sharp knocks, hard and deliberate, reverberating along the VW's aluminum side. My breath caught, and my body tensed as though physically bracing for an impact I could not anticipate. I gripped the flashlight and unlatched the door, but the moment I stepped outside, silence claimed the forest again. The fog hung low, curling in slow, deliberate spirals, and every branch, every distant ridge seemed poised to collapse into threat. I scanned the perimeter, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and saw only the outlines of the trees, indifferent and immense. Yet the feeling persisted, that I was being watched, studied, and perhaps even toyed with by some invisible presence. Hours passed in a state of hyper-awareness. Every snap of ice beneath a branch, every distant animal call felt exaggerated, almost theatrical. My mind replayed the knocks, the scars on the trees, the strange metallic scent, and I realized that the fear was no longer external alone. It had seeped into me, worming into my thoughts, sharpening every shadow into suspicion, every sound into forewarning. Sleep became impossible. My muscles ached from tension, and my eyes remained fixed on the darkened tree line, unwilling to relax. By morning, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I attempted a final hike, sticking to the most obvious trail I could find, but the forest seemed altered. The fog lingered in unnatural pockets, the snow bore marks that shifted slightly as I looked away and back, and the trees loomed with an almost sentient presence. My steps became hesitant, and I felt my pulse hammering in my throat with each quiet scrape of snow or branch. Returning to the camper, I decided to document the experience, to at least give form to the intangible weight pressing against me. My notebook filled with careful, deliberate notes, thud patterns, sketches of the tree scratches, observations about sounds and scents. Writing it down grounded me, but it could not fully dispel the unease, the sense that something was waiting for me in silence. That evening, I lit the stove again, preparing a simple meal, my eyes flicking constantly toward the shadows outside. The knocks came again, but this time the rhythm was different, slower, more deliberate, almost taunting. I pressed my ear against the camper wall, straining to locate the source, to rationalize the sound, but my rational mind recoiled, realizing that reason alone could not account for the visceral panic surging through me. I stayed upright all night, flashlight gripped tightly, every nerve screaming. Sleep came only in short bursts of exhaustion, dreamlike flashes where the forest itself seemed to press into the camper, bending reality into a cold, tactile dread. The knocks echoed in my mind, reverberating long after they had stopped, shaping my perception of every sound, every movement, every shadow. By the third morning, I knew I could not linger another night. Packing was slow, each motion deliberate, as if the very act of preparing to leave could anchor me against the tide of fear that had consumed me. I double-checked the locks, the steps, the stove, my supplies, everything in meticulous order, before climbing into the VW, the engine's hum of fragile comfort. Driving away, the mountain seemed indifferent, the fog curling in lazy eddies around the ridges. The forest reclaimed itself in normalcy, yet the marks of the previous days lingered in my mind. The knocks that defied explanation, the scars on the trees, the metallic scent in the air, and the crushing weight of being watched. My pulse gradually slowed as the road unwound before me, but the experience had embedded itself in my consciousness, a quiet, persistent dread that lingered long after the VW had left the campground behind. Even weeks later, when I recount the trip to friends or strangers, I find myself hesitating, searching for words that do justice to the tension, the subtle terror, the almost imperceptible shifts in the environment that so thoroughly unmoored me. It wasn't a monster or a creature or anything overtly supernatural. It was the mountain itself, the forest, the isolation, and my own mind's response to being alone in a place that seemed to watch and weigh me at every turn. The lesson I took away, though, is not one of fear without remedy. I learned to respect instincts, to honor the subtle signals that something is off, to recognize that isolation can amplify the smallest anomaly into profound anxiety. I learned that preparedness extends beyond supplies and maps. It extends to mental fortitude, awareness, and the patience to observe without immediately seeking explanation. And I learned that some encounters leave marks not on the body, but deep in the mind, a lingering echo of tension and awareness that reshapes how you interact with the wild. Even now, when I drive through similar forests, hike quiet trails, or park my camper at dusk, I can feel it, a residual presence, subtle, insistent, a reminder that the mountain is alive in ways we cannot fully understand. That Roan mountain trip was February 2022. Yet every winter since, I find my senses sharpening at the first frost, my pulse quickening at the creak of a branch, and my mind instinctively alert to the knocks that do not come from the door. I never thought a simple camping trip could make the forest itself feel alive, like it was watching me. I'm in my early 30s, and for years, the idea of being alone in the wild was my escape, a chance to be untethered from the noise of the world, to drive my old Volkswagen camper deep into Virginia's George Washington National Forest and just breathe. But that September night in 2019, the forest breathed back, and it was nothing like I expected. I rolled my camper down a narrow dirt road that twisted through hills heavy with oaks and maples. The late afternoon sun filtered in streaks through the canopy, painting everything in shifting golds and ambers. I parked at a small clearing I'd scouted on a map, a modest site by a creek, partially shaded, with enough flat ground to level my camper. As I set the handbrake, a gust of wind carried the smell of wet leaves and something faintly metallic. I shrugged it off. The forest always had smells like that, a mix of earth and decay, life and rot, like it was inhaling everything I carried with me. I set up my campfire early, careful to clear a ring of stones. I stacked the wood meticulously, the rhythmic tap of each log settling against the next, strangely soothing. The fire sparked immediately, flames licking the air. I sat back against the edge of the camper, taking in the soft trickle of the creek, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Sound was always the forest's most honest element, I'd realized. You could hear it breathing before you saw it, its subtle movements before it revealed its presence. That day, the sounds seemed ordinary, but ordinary has a way of twisting into something else when the light fades. By dusk, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the first chill of autumn brushed my neck. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee, watching the fire pulse. That's when the first unusual noise came, a knock, sharp, deliberate, coming from somewhere just beyond the ring of trees that marked the edge of my clearing. I froze. The knock came again, faint but rhythmic, like a signal. I told myself it was a branch falling, that the wind was cleverer than it seemed. But something in me didn't let me believe that. I reached for a small flashlight and shone it toward the edge of the clearing. Shadows leapt and twisted in the beam, leaves rattling like teeth in the dark. I heard nothing else, no animal calls, no rustle of a deer fleeing, but my heart had begun a slow, insistent hammering that I could feel in my throat. I sipped my coffee, trying to ground myself, the warmth helping more than I expected. I reasoned that inexperience, the isolation, the half-light, it was all playing tricks. Yet, every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard movement, a scrape against bark, a whisper of sound, just too deliberate to be random. The first time the fire blew out, I laughed. A gust, that was all. But when I relit it, carefully arranging the embers, the flames sputtered and died again. I scowled, kicking the dirt to disperse some sparks, telling myself it was careless stacking or damp wood. But then it happened a third time. Flames surged for a brief heartbeat and went out as if someone had exhaled on them. The sound around me seemed to swell, pressing closer. A rustle to the left, a snap to the right. Every brush of wind through the leaves exaggerated into something sinister. I tried talking to myself, aloud even, repeating mundane phrases to break the tension. It's just the wind, just the wind. The forest didn't answer. I decided to secure myself in the camper. I climbed in, the creak of the hinges louder than it had ever been. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I listened. At first, only the creak and the wind. Then, soft, almost imperceptible at first, the knock returned, steady, pacing somewhere just beyond the circle of firelight. I held my breath, ears straining. The sound of my own heartbeat seemed to fill my ears. I told myself it had to be a raccoon, maybe an overzealous squirrel. But there was a deliberateness to it, the rhythm too exact, too aware, like it was acknowledging me. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed suspended. Every now and then, I dared to glance out the camper window, flashlight in hand. Shadows leapt in the trees, but I never saw anything tangible. The creek burbled, mocking in its constancy. The wind whispered, and the knocks continued, slow and deliberate. Then, without warning, the fire flickered back to life on its own. Flames licked at the logs, warm and inviting, but the relief was fleeting. With each flare of light, the noises around me intensified, the brush scratching harder, leaves rattling closer, a low groan that could have been the wind or something else. I pulled a blanket around my shoulders, trying to concentrate on sound patterns, trying to rationalize. The temperature dropped sharply, making my breath visible. I shivered, noticing how small, how fragile the Volkswagen felt against the looming forest. Every sound was magnified inside the camper, the knock echoing against the walls, the creak of my own movements. I considered leaving, driving back down the dark road, but I was trapped by the dense trees and my own indecision. Somewhere in that hesitation, dread rooted itself. You don't just fear what's out there, you fear your own inability to act, your imagination taking the first step toward panic. By midnight, the rhythm of the knocks changed. Faster now, more erratic. I couldn't focus on the creek, couldn't ignore the wind. It all became a blur of sound pressing in on me from every direction. I paced inside the camper, flashlight sweeping the clearing. Nothing. I tried calling out, my voice a thin thread against the forest. Silence, then a snapping of branches far too deliberate to ignore. The sound was close now, surrounding me. I imagined eyes peering through the darkness, every sense straining against the veil of night. Sleep was impossible. I huddled in the corner, listening, trying to count the knocks, mapping them in my mind. Sometimes they stopped entirely, and I'd exhale only for a sudden rustle or thump to jolt me upright. My mind played cruel tricks. A falling log became a figure. A shadow became a presence. Sound was all I had, and the forest wielded it like a weapon. The creek's gentle burble was drowned by my own racing pulse. The Volkswagen felt smaller, more vulnerable. I felt as if the walls were pressing inward, the ceiling low, every noise amplified into potential danger. Dawn broke with a timid gray light, and the forest seemed different. Less threatening, but still alive, still listening. The knocks had stopped, the wind had calmed, but the memory lingered in every creak of the camper, in the faint echo of my own heartbeat. I dared a glance outside. The clearing was empty, the fire reduced to gray ashes. Nothing had moved, yet everything had shifted. I packed up in a daze, the forest still whispering, rustling, just beyond perception. Even as I drove away, the soundscape lingered in my mind. The forest had revealed a simple truth. It doesn't need to show itself to scare you. Sound, carefully observed and carefully ignored, can become your adversary, a mirror to your own fears. I never understood that more clearly than on that night, when the campfire blew out repeatedly and the forest seemed to breathe with intent. The road out of the clearing felt unreal, like I was moving through a place that existed only to remind me how fragile solitude could be. The Volkswagen hummed beneath me, its engine a comforting, steady sound after a night dominated by the forest's whispers. I wanted to shake off the unease, to convince myself it had been my imagination, but the memory of those knocks, so deliberate and unyielding, clung to my mind like a shadow I couldn't outrun. Every creak of the van on the uneven dirt road reminded me how small I really was, how quickly fear could root itself into your bones. I drove in silence, the forest thinning as I descended from the hills. Morning light filtered in pale beams through lingering fog, painting everything in muted grays and soft greens. But it wasn't the kind of morning that brought comfort. Even in daylight, the rustling of leaves sounded sharper, more intentional, as though the forest remembered the night before and was waiting, patient, silent in its watch. I tried to focus on the small creek that ran alongside the road, the way it glittered and twisted in the morning light, but the memory of midnight's rhythm, the knocks, the scrapes, the whispered timing, refused to leave me. By the time I stopped at a small overlook to stretch my legs, my hands were still trembling. The wind whispered across the valley, carrying the faint scent of wet earth, pine, and something metallic I couldn't name. I leaned against the van, closed my eyes, and tried to exhale the tension knotting my chest. The soundscape of the forest, the clicks, the creaks, the faint hum of insects, was no longer comforting. Every subtle noise seemed to suggest presence, awareness, something that observed and judged just out of sight. My imagination flared with possibilities: raccoons, deer, a wandering hiker. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The sound had a pattern, a precision, a pacing that no ordinary animal could sustain. I decided to drive further, deeper into the park, partly to regain control and partly because leaving too quickly felt like admitting defeat. My destination was a more open area, one I'd passed by before, where the trees were sparse and the wind could blow freely across a ridge. I reasoned that distance and perspective might strip the forest of its oppressive presence. But even as I climbed the switchbacks, I felt the echoes of the night following me. Every rock tumbling under the tires sounded like a footstep. Every branch brushing against the van scraped a note of warning against the hum of the engine. When I arrived at the ridge, I parked and stepped out, letting the wind wash over me. It was brighter here, more open. Sunlight struck my face, and the forest fell behind me in rolling shadows. Yet the sounds didn't cease. The creaks, the scratches, the tiny knocks seemed embedded in the air itself, bouncing off the terrain, forming an invisible rhythm I couldn't locate or ignore. I wandered a few yards from the van, scanning the slopes and the trees, every muscle taut, every sense straining. The forest seemed quiet, almost indifferent, yet the memory of the night pressed against me with a weight I could not shrug off. I tried to focus on normal tasks, checking supplies, refilling water, noting the best spots for firewood, but the forest kept intruding. The creak of a branch, the sudden flutter of a bird's wings, the faint drip of moisture from leaves onto the ground, they all became suspect, coded with intention. My mind began replaying the night over and over, each iteration twisting slightly more sinister. I imagined shadows moving just beyond vision, shapes crouching, listening, pacing in the rhythm of my own fear. The fire that had sputtered and died, the knocks that had followed me into my own shelter, they were no longer just noises. They had become a language I didn't understand but could feel in every nerve ending. I returned to the Volkswagen, heart hammering, and tried to prepare another fire. I stacked the logs carefully, just as I had the previous night, and struck a match. For a moment, the flame caught perfectly. But then the wind, as if mocking me, picked up suddenly, howling through the ridge, and the fire blew out, scattering sparks across the dirt. I froze, ears straining for the return of the knocks. They didn't come at first, and I allowed myself a shallow breath. Then, softly at first and then growing, a tapping, rhythmic, purposeful. Somewhere near the edge of the trees, a sound that mirrored the pattern from the night before. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, every nerve alive, every instinct screaming. I debated leaving, driving down into the valley, but the road was narrow, the incline steep, and something in me refused to abandon the ridge. I sat, listening, letting the Volkswagen's metal body vibrate beneath me as if it could shield me from the forest's attention. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments, but each cycle of the wind, each whisper of leaves, each faint knock or rustle reinforced a simple truth. I was alone, but not entirely unseen. The sound pressed against me, a psychological force that felt tangible. I realized then that fear wasn't just about threat. It was about anticipation, about the unknown, about the possibility that every noise could be a harbinger. Night returned with slow inevitability. The sunlight faded, shadows stretched, and the temperature dropped sharply. I relit the fire, careful to block the wind with rocks and logs, watching the flames for signs of betrayal. The forest seemed alive in the darkness in ways that daylight could not reveal. Every sound was amplified, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the whispering wind, and I found myself listening for patterns, trying to map intentions where there might be none. The Volkswagen felt like both fortress and cage, the thin walls no barrier to the psychological weight pressing down. Then I heard it more clearly. A knock, singular, deliberate, and close, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, breath caught, pulse rising. The sound echoed against the camper walls, exaggerated in the small space, and my mind raced through possibilities. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it outward. Shadows leapt and twisted, but the clearing appeared empty. And yet I could not shake the certainty that the sound had come from somewhere specific, somewhere aware, somewhere waiting. Hours of listening followed. I refused to sleep, refusing to close my eyes for even a moment. The forest's noises, the wind, the creak, the distant brush, formed a chorus of tension, each element punctuated by the occasional knock or scrape, subtle but deliberate. I began talking to myself, whispering instructions, rationalizing possibilities, repeating mantras. It's just sound, it's just movement. Nothing is there. But the repetition offered no relief. The forest had infiltrated my perception. Each sound was no longer merely environmental, it was psychological, a mirror of my own unease. By the second dawn, exhaustion and hypervigilance had blurred the edges of fear into something more primal. I could no longer separate imagination from reality. Every leaf scraping against bark became a figure, every small thud a threat. The Volkswagen felt impossibly small, impossibly exposed. I packed quickly, hands trembling, fire extinguished and ashes cold, convinced that leaving would finally release me from the oppressive rhythm that had dominated 2 nights. And as I drove down the winding road, the forest receding behind me, I realized that the sound, the pressure of it, the precision, the psychological weight, would follow me longer than any physical trace of the night. Even now, years later, when I think of George Washington National Forest, I hear the echo of those knocks. I hear the rhythm of a forest aware of me, patient and deliberate. I remember how sound can shape reality, can alter perception, can press against the mind until fear becomes inseparable from thought. The fire that blew out repeatedly was not merely an inconvenience. It was a signal, a reminder that control is tenuous, that isolation can be more than solitude, that the forest, in its quiet insistence, has a presence that is patient, persistent, and inescapable.